Hello, writers. Today I want to talk about another ingredient in storytelling, which is character. So character is such an interesting ingredient in stories. So I know that last week I talked about POV, point of view, as being a critical ingredient of storytelling, and that's totally true. But point of view wouldn't really exist at all if you didn't have characters, right? Point of view is sort of a vehicle for helping us, the readers, see and experience your character, and so therefore you need a character to have a point of view. And the reason that characters are so important in storytelling, even if you don't have a character-driven story, is that characters are really the primary vehicle for your reader to explore, understand, and experience the story or the world of your story. It's worth paying some attention to character and kind of examining character, both in your own work and also in the work of other writers that you like and admire, or maybe even writers you don't like, because sometimes we can learn a lot from media and content and art that we don't like also. So everything is worth looking at, in my opinion. So I thought today, instead of giving you a checklist of how to develop character, because there's already a lot of material out there for that, and I will find some and link to them below in the description box of things that I've used, I thought I might walk you through the development of my character in my current work in progress, which I am calling for the moment Gothic Ghost Story, because I am terrible at titles, and that's usually the last thing that I think of when I am writing. Every once in a while, a great title will come to me and sort of ask to have a story written about it, but typically that's not how I work, and titles are my weakness. And if you're really good at coming up with titles, then please let me know. I want to know how you do it and what your secret is. Anyway, that is neither here nor there. Let us talk about characters, and I'm going to walk you through sort of my process of coming up with my protagonist in this Gothic ghost story that I am working on at the moment. I don't know if I've ever talked about this before, but typically when I start a story, I actually start with an image, a mood, or a feeling. And maybe this sounds strange because I do believe in the power of character, and characters are often central to my writing, as I know it is for a lot of people, but it's often not the character that comes to me first. Instead, I get a vivid, I guess it's almost like a still from a film or a painting, and it's usually very moody, atmospheric. It conveys a kind of tone, but overall it's this feeling that I want to capture, and I think that's where almost all of my stories start, is what is that image and that feeling that I'm trying to evoke. And so I'll start with that. I'll think of that in my mind, and then I'll ask myself, okay, who is in this image, or who is experiencing this feeling? How are they moving through this mood and the space that I am envisioning? And honestly, that's about as far as I get before I start writing. I am a discovery writer, also sometimes known as a pantser. But I like discovery writer a little bit better, because for me that conveys more clearly the feeling that I have when I'm writing, which is that I am discovering the story, I'm discovering the theme, I'm discovering the character and the elements, and that's sort of how I write. So I'll start with that image, and then I'll immediately sit down and start writing something about that image and trying out a character who might fit in that image. For my current work in progress, the thing that I started with was that I wanted a haunted house story, but I wanted the haunted house to be like dark academia. So it was going to be like Gothic, haunted house, and dark academia, and that was kind of the vibes that I was going for. So then I thought, okay, so it's a haunted house, but what if it is a women's dormitory? And what if the setting is like 1908-ish? Initially, I thought it was like 1905. Now I've settled on 1908 just because of other convenient real world reasons that aren't super relevant right now. And the girls' dormitory, I like that idea because it is a space that I thought has a lot of rich potential for interactions, for drama, for conflict, and also for spookiness. And I love exploring the ways that a group of people can experience spooky, creepy events. And I decided that this was a girls' dormitory that had been converted from a mansion that was built in 1878. That is a time that I particularly love in American architecture, 1878. There's some wonderful mansions that are still standing from that time period, and it's also a time when I feel like a lot of American design imagination went wild. And so I imagine that the person who built this mansion, and see, here's another character, is because when I'm thinking about the setting and when I'm thinking about a house, I ask myself, who built this house and why? And I think it was a very eccentric woman, extremely wealthy, who is the driving force behind the architecture of this house, which is going to be my haunted house. So that's pretty cool. So she also figures in the story a little bit, although not directly. She's kind of in the background. Okay, so the main character, let's get back to her. I do often start with the main character or the protagonist just because it's usually the person that I most want to follow as I explore the setting or the world that I'm starting to set up. It's the person I most want to experience the feeling, that the imagery that I'm conveying, how it impacts them. So I thought to myself, okay, what is going to bring my protagonist to this setting? Well, she's probably a college student. That would make her one of many people who live at this women's dormitory. That would make sense for her. So how did she come here and why is she here? In 1908, it was not as typical or as expected for young women to go to college as it might be today. So I wanted to explore a little bit her reasons for coming, but more on that in a minute. So once I have a sense of why my character is in the setting or coming to the setting, and I might start thinking about how is she going to interact with the setting, I don't write a character sketch as such. I've done that in the past, and I will say that sometimes it is useful and fun, but I don't know. For me, deciding what the character's favorite color is or their most significant memory as a child, I mean, it depends. Sometimes that stuff is relevant, and if it helps you, for sure, go for it. But for me, especially if I'm writing a shorter work, it seems like a lot of work to unearth details that will end up being irrelevant or don't ever get touched on. For a novel, maybe it makes more sense because for a novel, you may want some of that information or you may want some of that backstory available to you as you write your character. So in this case, my work in progress is a novella. It's currently at 35,000 words, and I think I'm going to add another 3,000 or so and then probably cut it down. I am an overwriter. Discovery writers, I think, are often overwriters, not always. Maureen's a discovery writer too, and she's an underwriter. But for me, I tend to write more than I need because that's my process for discovering. So that's about the length it is. And for that length, I don't feel like I want to get into all the character sketchy details. I want to really focus in on the things that are going to help me pinpoint the key character traits that are going to matter to this story. So let's go back to the feeling once again. That feeling, that mood, this gothic dark academia ghost story that I want to evoke with this house, this sort of ugly, odd, outrageous house that I envision at the center of it. Here's where I think genre exploration can also be really fruitful, at least for me. I think about, well, what are the hallmarks of the Gothic haunted house genre? I knew that one of the tropes that I want to play with is this Gothic idea of strangeness, that the house itself is strange, but also often the people who come to the house are strangers to the house, right? A lot of Gothic stories start with a visitor, someone who is outside the family, or maybe even a group of people who are completely new, who are kind of explorers, and they come to this strange house and they spend some time there, they explore it, they try to unearth its secrets and so on. So it becomes sort of a story of the people versus the house. But I think that thread of otherness I wanted to interrogate who is other and what is other. One of the things that I love about Gothic literature is that it is really a domestic form of horror or terror or discomfort, where something that should be a source of shelter and nurturing and comfort, that is your home or the place where you live, like a dormitory, which becomes your temporary home, becomes instead a source of terror, discomfort, and horror. And I really love that about Gothic literature. And that's one of the reasons that I chose that mode to write in for this piece. So as I said, I wanted to take on the question of who is the other really, and how is the other constructed in literature. And I think one big inspiration for this is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, because that takes the Gothic mode and turns that question of who is the other, who is the stranger, who belongs and who doesn't belong, into a story that grapples with racism, with this idea of racial purity, like white supremacist racial purity and eugenics, in a really novel, interesting way that fits perfectly in with classic themes of Gothic literature. So back to characters. So now that I've asked myself, what are the themes? What's the image? What's the genre? Why am I interested in stories like this? What are the kinds of things that I want to evoke with my story, and the imagery and the mood and the tone and so on? Let's get back to the character. How does the character fit into this mood, tone, setting, and imagery? I also sometimes think about, well, what character would not fit here? Because that can also be an interesting tension. Given your genre, is there a character who can subvert that genre or fight against some of the themes that are naturally suggested by your mood or your imagery? So maybe you could have a very moody, dark, creepy, Gothic vibe, but then the character that shows up is incessantly cheerful and optimistic, and right? Like that could be maybe an interesting way to play off of the setting. But in this case, I decided that my protagonist is going to reinforce some of those themes of strangeness and otherness, and she's going to be a stranger. So I decided to make her a Japanese woman, young Japanese woman who has come to New Hampshire to study. She is not only a stranger in the story, she's been a stranger her whole life. Her father and mother are diplomats and they've traveled around the world. So she's the kind of kid who kind of grew up without ever having a real stable home outside of her parents. She always had to go to new schools and adjust and never made long-term friends. And I think that, to me, reinforces a sense of personal and individual isolation that I think will be really interesting when she gets into that Gothic setting. So by the time she comes to New Hampshire, she's so used to being an outsider that she's kind of taken that on as part of her identity and almost as part of her brand, if you will. And I think that's going to play into the story's themes in a really interesting way. And it also puts her on guard, in a sense, from the moment she arrives, which I thought was really interesting to have this very guarded character. I also think that the college setting can work really well with her personal sense of alienation, because often alienation is a very common experience that students have when they get to college. They're away from home for the first time, they're away from their high school friends and their routines, and they have a whole bunch of new stuff thrown at them with often very little support, and that can be a very disorienting time and a very alienating time. It's also around the time of your life's development when you're trying to figure out who you are, and the sense of where do I belong, at least for me when I was that age, was very present. That question was extremely present in my mind. Where do I belong? How do I know I belong there? How do I find my people? And maybe I don't belong anywhere. And I think, again, with my MC, her name is Tomoe, with my main character's overall sense of outsiderness and strangeness with the Gothic mood and themes, I like that she is a young college student coming to America and away from her parents for the first time and dealing with all of this. I think those themes very neatly reinforce each other in a way that I like for this story. By the way, I should mention that throughout all this, I am writing. I've already started writing. I decided to write in first person POV, which someday I'll do a video on because I do think it's really interesting. And I have written a scene. It's her arrival at the college. I'm trying to understand how she feels about it and so on. So I'm doing all of this exploration as I'm actually writing words in my manuscript. And the next thing that I ask myself is, why is she here? What does she want? And I think this is a critical question to ask. I know a lot of articles give this advice. What does your main character want? Sometimes it's useful to separate want from need. So want is typically defined as something that the character is aware of. It is a goal that is conscious that they are striving to achieve. Whereas need can be something that is more subtle and more subconscious, and they may not even understand that they need that. The reader should get a sense that they need that thing. But sometimes part of the character growth is that they recognize that need in the end, and then they're able to actually go for it. Another cool trick is to have the want and the need be in opposition to each other. But in this case, I've made sort of conflict boxes and charts and things like that in the past, but for this particular story, I didn't do that. And instead, I just sort of thought about what would drive her. What does she want first? And I thought, well, she really wants academic achievement. That's why she's going to college, which was quite unusual for young women, especially Japanese young women of the time. She's going to college in another country, so she's already setting up yet another obstacle for herself, potentially. And she's driven to academic achievement because she feels like if she's successful in that realm, then she doesn't really need to be accepted. And that is where her need comes in, because I realized that what she really needs is to belong, to be accepted, to find friends, community, family, something she's been missing her whole life. Even though she does have a family, but they're a little bit estranged and they don't quite see eye to eye, and she feels estranged from them a little bit. So I like that what she wants is academic achievement, because she, in a way, she views it as a substitute for acceptance. She thinks that if she can prove that she is the best and the smartest, that will make her bulletproof against feelings of rejection. And that brings me to what does she fear, which is often tied, I think, to want and need. One way to think about what does she fear, or what does she think is the worst thing that could happen to her, is to contrast that with what does she need or what does she want. So one way to think of it might be that, well, her biggest fear is that she will fail and have to drop out of school and go back to her parents and basically think of herself as a failure. And she is very afraid of that. And I think that's true. I think she is afraid of that. But I think more than that, her deepest fear is tied to her need. So if her need is to be accepted, then her deepest fear is fear of rejection. And I wanted to make that fear more personal and less general. So I gave her a couple of other characters that specifically she is afraid of being rejected by. These are potential friend characters that she meets, and they kind of have a connection and a bond, but she is ultimately very afraid that they will end up rejecting her. I also think that deep down she knows that academic achievement is not and cannot be a substitute for really finding community and being accepted, but she kind of doesn't let herself acknowledge that yet. And I think that's going to be part of her journey, is that she is going to have to grapple with that. Okay, so far so good. I was feeling pretty good about her as a basis for the character, and I kept writing the second scene and so on. But I realized that as she started interacting with people at the college, she was coming off as a bit stiff. She was so intense and so ambitious and so, I don't know, single-minded, that she really felt brittle and stiff and kind of one note. So I decided I needed to inject a little bit of quirkiness to her, or a little more texture to her. And I decided that she is also actually quite sarcastic. But the trick here is that she doesn't let her sarcasm show around authority figures, because she's also very academically motivated, and she doesn't want her sarcasm or her quips or her dry humor to potentially sabotage her academic achievements if she pisses off the dean of students who she talks to early on in the story, or any of the professors. So that sarcasm, that wit, that jokey side of her only comes out when she's extremely comfortable, or in subtle ways where the person she's talking to doesn't realize that she's made a sarcastic comment or a joke. And that gave me a little bit more fun to play with for her, because of course characters are not a monolith. They're not going to be one way all the time. So finding something that contrasts with a primary character trait, or a character trait that you have decided on initially, I think can be a really good way to add some dimension to a character and make them seem more real. One thing to remember throughout all of this is that you don't have to make these decisions forever right away. You don't have to set your character in stone and decide that these are the immutable traits, right? You can change as you go, you can add more, you can take away. It's all good. Don't feel like you have to be locked into a character. In fact, I would say that because I am a discovery writer, my characters do change a lot. And often I have to go back and rewrite parts of the character because I've changed my mind about who they are. Yeah, it sucks. Writing is hard. But my process is my process, and I've learned to just embrace it rather than try to fight against it. All right, I have one final tip for you about character, and that is to think about friends, enemies, and lovers. You may or may not have the space in your story for any of these people, and that's fine. In a novel, you might have actual characters who show up who occupy those roles for your MC, for your main character, your protagonist, but in, say, a short story or a very compressed novella, you might not have the space to explore that. But I think it's really fun because it says a lot about someone, who their friends are, who their enemies are, and who they fall in love with. So if you feel so moved, I would suggest that you spend a little bit of time exploring those questions for your main character. In my case, Tomoe's enemy is somebody who is actually maybe someone like her in a way. And this is a great way, in my opinion, to make a villain or an antagonist or an enemy, is to create someone who shares some characteristics with the protagonist. Because I think, A, it's interesting to see that kind of duality in a story, and B, I think it can ring very true to life. Sometimes we become resentful of or envious of somebody who is actually quite like us. And in that person, we sometimes see our worst qualities that we hate about ourselves reflected back at us in a really unpleasant and glaring way. I know that that is true for me. So it's something that I find interesting to explore in fiction as well. So in this case, Tomoe's enemy is a young woman named Elizabeth, who is extremely accomplished, very wealthy, very academically driven as well, and is not exactly a nemesis, but it is someone whom Tomoe at first feels that she wants to be friends with, but then ends up being more antagonistic towards, as she realizes that actually Elizabeth's core value is quite different from hers. So I thought that was an interesting way to play with an antagonist, is that initially Tomoe feels like, oh, I found someone who is like me, and then realize, oh no, they're not like me, or at least I hope I am not like them, because who they are is actually quite horrible and awful, and I don't want to be like that. And again, this helps me think about Tomoe and my main character in a way almost more than it helps me think about Elizabeth, the antagonist. As for her friends, I decided that her friends are two other women in the dorm who are also outsiders in their own way. I think, again, this reflects a lot of patterns that we see in real life where you have people who've been ostracized coming together to form a little mini community on their own. I also think it makes sense for Tomoe that she is too fearful of rejection to reach out directly to Elizabeth or to big groups of people. She is not gregarious. She's not outgoing. She's not an extrovert. She doesn't enjoy putting herself out there socially. In a way, her academic focus is an excuse for her, I think, not to try to make friends. But these two people she meets and almost accidentally becomes friends with, they sort of fall across each other's paths and they share a moment and they become friendly. But it's a friendship that grows unevenly. They don't become insta friends. In fact, they're a little bit hostile to each other when they first meet. And it's not clear, I think, initially whether they will become friends, which I think fits with my MC's reluctance in general to put too much of herself out there or to form intimate bonds too quickly. But at the same time, I think she does recognize the outsider status of those other two people. And I think that is attractive to her. She feels like, oh, I know what that's like to be an outsider, and they might know what it's like for me to be an outsider because they've experienced being othered along different axes. So they build a bond over that. And finally, her lover, Tomoe, does develop a crush on someone in my story. Kind of don't want to say who because I want you all to read it. But I think this was really a great exercise for me to think about what kind of person would she feel irresistibly drawn to, right? What sorts of qualities does she find attractive? What sorts of qualities does she find valuable in somebody else? And when you do it for your own character, you can also think about, well, what are the qualities she thinks she should admire? Like maybe there's a person that she thinks she should be with or be attracted to, but then there's the person that she's really attracted to. And why is that? What I don't like is when a story tells me that two characters are attracted to each other or that one character is attracted to another, but doesn't show it to me, doesn't show me why. I can't figure out what the appeal is of this other, the love object, if you will, this person that the character has fallen for. For me, I need to be able to see. And especially when it's a first person protagonist, which my story is, I want to evoke in the reader just a little spark of the feeling that Tomoe is feeling when she gazes upon her love object or hears the love object's speech. Okay, so I think I will stop there. And as I mentioned, I'm still working on this. It is 35,000 words, but it's not quite done yet. And after I do finish that final scene, which hopefully is soon, then I will have a much better idea of how I want to structure the character, my main character, and the secondary characters, and how I want her arc to evolve. So right now I feel like I'm still kind of working out where she's going, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's me. I don't necessarily recommend my process because it is very time consuming and it's scary to not know where you're going. But I've tried lots of other processes, and while sometimes it works to do a little more planning ahead of time, it often does not. And like I said before, I have learned to just embrace the writer that I am and not try to fight too hard against it. So there you have it. If you do try some of these techniques or ask yourself some of these questions about your work in progress, please let me know how it goes. I would love to hear about what you are working on. Happy writing!